So this is part two. Oh, Raj, you going to introduce this, or should I introduce this?
Let's let the white man introduce.
So this is the second week where we're going to have more discussions, hopefully, of a more amicable and less I'm upset I'm walking off kind, which happened last week, about Englishness, English identity, what it means and what the problems and issues are facing us as English people. And it's something that Raj wanted to see discussed again this week.
I thought when I listened to the conversation, big up to Braden, I do know Braden, I just didn't think it was a conducive or productive conversation.
He wasn't that sober, which didn't help.
On such a serious topic, because this is a topic that I kind of feel that is important. I don't personally, my own standpoint, just a quick overview, I don't see myself as English, I see myself as British, WC, and on top of that, I don't see what John Cleese said as being racist.
No.
I think it's just an observational fact.
And what did he say, just to remind us all?
He basically said that London is not an English city anymore, something to that effect.
Yeah.
If I said it wrong, then somebody.
No, and he was condemned by the Mayor of London and by all sorts of media people for being racist and so on.
What's your kind of stance on that comment?
Well, as I said last week, I think what he said was an accurate observation. I've noticed this myself, having been brought up here. I live up the road here. I get a bus down here, and over the last 10, 20 years, I've noticed that more and more people are not only not English, but not even speaking English. So to the extent now that when I get a bus down the road here on a Sunday, no one speaks English at all on the bus. So we get there's no English speaking people. Dude. So should this matter? Is this an issue? I think we're not allowed to say, we meaning English people, are not allowed to say there is an issue, that many of us feel uncomfortable with living with and sharing our lives with people who don't obviously share our history, our culture, our traditions, our background. By history, I mean going back to the Civil War, back to the Elizabethan settlement, back to the relationship between the monarch and the Parliament and the legislature. By culture, I mean all those things that we identify as being English. And now we're living cheek by jowl with people who we don't share that shared value, that shared history with. And that makes many of us feel uncomfortable. And that's not racism in my view at all, any more than it would be if the same phenomena happened to the Japanese or to the Nigerians or to Saudi Arabians, or even Turkey. So I think this is a fair observation. It's not something we should be hung up about. But there are demographic changes, as some people call it, that are happening to this country, which are alarming many people. And some of the demographic predictions for the future are that English people will be a minority in England within, say, 50 years. And in fact, that's actually the prediction for every single European country, that the indigenous population would be a minority within perhaps one generation. Should this bother us? Well, many people say, well, no, why should it be? To be an issue for us is
from camera to camera, I can see that.
Is racism. I don't think it's racism any more than it would be for the Aboriginals or other peoples who have an attachment to their land, who are suddenly living cheek by jowl with people who, in large numbers, who are now living in the same geographical area as them, and that becomes an issue for them. So I think that's just a natural human thing.
I think your take on, like, if you just give your background as well, that would be good.
Basically, I'm of like a Turkish Bosnian background. I grew up in a very English town, High Wycombe. I'm not sure if you know where High Wycombe is. So basically, what I think about what John Cleese said. Now, what John Cleese said was an observation in terms of the actual words that came out of his mouth, or whatever he typed on Twitter.
Yeah.
However, with some of these quotes, you have to look at subtleties sometimes. So it's true, English people have become a minority in London. However, sometimes when people mention how London is foreign or how London is non-English, they are code words for people basically trying to say that London is a shithole because there are too many foreigners there, or there are too many people of ethnic backgrounds. Now, this might sound a bit anecdotal, but as growing up in a majority English town, I had many friends who in many cases wouldn't even come to London, and when I would ask why, they would simply say it's crap because there are too many of so-and-so people there, or it's dangerous because there are too many Muslims there, or too many this people and that people. And sometimes, this country has a problem in that there is a huge rural and urban divide. So people from more rural areas of England, where the population is either 90% white English, they have a problem understanding multiculturalism. And sometimes it's not just the English people's fault, sometimes it's also the fault of people of foreign backgrounds who possibly need to integrate more as well. But this country at the moment, we're at a precipice and we're at a huge divide. And if we continue down this route, we might, things might unfortunately boil over, and I hope that's not the case. But some of the things I've heard over time, I don't think are helpful for inter-ethnic relations in this country.
Did you have any thoughts?
What John Cleese said was factual. Right? It's the fact that he's upset by that implies the racism. Not what he stated. He made a correct observation, but he seems to think it's a negative thing, or that it saddens him. As for London no longer being English, it's always been a city of immigrants.
It's been an international.
I mean, going back to the Huguenots who came to East London, the poorest part of London. I have a theory that the Cockney accent and the dropping of the H's comes from the French accent, hotel and such like. When
I hadn't thought of that before.
Well, it's a theory, and then Huguenot churches were turned into synagogues when poor
and then
Jewish
synagogues turned into mosques.
Yeah, exactly. So East London has always been the home of the poorest in London, the immigrant communities, whether they were Huguenot, Jewish or Bangladeshi, and the East End of London where all the sewage would gush out towards. That's why it was always the poor end of town, and the West End was the rich end. So London has always been multicultural, multi-ethnic, but maybe white Huguenots and white Ashkenazi European Jews blend in a few generations later more easily than the Bangladeshis, because they are visibly foreign, and that is what John Cleese perhaps means when he says the town's no longer English.
And I just give my input on this because I've always said that if I see myself as British Punjabi Sikh, I don't see myself as English. I think English is a race, and I'm a Punjabi by race. But I'm a British person and I love the UK. A lot of people call me British Raj or I'm a freaking traitor. But I live here and I want the best for the UK, even though I condemn their colonial past. But the thing is that if I went back to the Punjab, where my people are from, which is now more of an ethnic kind of Sikh state, Punjabi state, and there was 30% Chinese people, and the area started changing, and the language started changing, the food started changing, the whole area started changing, I would be upset, not because I hate the Chinese people, but because I would feel like my culture or my people's land is being changed. I think what John Cleese is kind of saying isn't a racial thing. I think it's more of a loss of identity he's feeling when he's coming to looking at his own homeland, and London in particular. I don't see it as, if you're upset about it, I don't think that's an issue per se. It's what you do with it when you're upset. If you're just saying you're upset and you're explaining, look, I don't hate these people, but I love what it was like before, I don't see a massive issue with that being, too controversial in my opinion.
You're not English, right? Sorry.
Yeah.
You're not English?
No.
Are you a Londoner?
I'm a Londoner, I'm British, and I'm Punjabi Sikh.
So in a sense you're from England as well?
Yeah, I mean, I always say I'm made up of 3 components, and without each one, I wouldn't be who I am. I'm British.
Can I
I'm
challenge what
Punjabi
you...
by ethnicity and Sikh by religion.
Can I just challenge what you're saying?
Yeah.
I recall as a child when I came down here to Speaker's Corner, and I saw Lord Soper, who's now dead. He was a Methodist preacher, a very famous one. He had obviously in the House of Lords. And you can still see footage from that time. And the people down here were not multiracial. They were 99% white at that time.
They might be Irish, Polish,
yeah,
Huguenot.
but they weren't. Most people down here now are not white. They are Arabs or whatever they're from. So there has been a substantial change, for good or not. I'm just saying that I don't think to say we've always been like that is misleading, because there's been quite a substantial change since even in my lifetime.
You wouldn't notice whether someone was an Anglo-Saxon or a Scotsman or Irish or Ashkenazi Jews, because they're all the same colour.
Maybe.
Yeah, so you meet a lot of people that are from...
An Ashkenazi Jew may or may not have been the same.
So, for an example, the Polish, within 3 or 4 generations, I guarantee you the descendants will pretty much be English. And they will say we're from Polish descent. Whereas we are always going to be... I mean, it is a colour thing, though. Whether we like it or not, it is a colour thing.
I think I agree with Raj, because when people talk about English identity as being not racial but an ethnic identity, maybe they mean our shared culture, our shared history. But I think there is a racial side to it as well in reality, and that's the elephant in the room people don't mention, because there is an element of being white about it. Now, of course, whiteness is not an English thing. It's a French thing, it's a German thing, it's a Finnish thing, whatever. But it is nevertheless a race. So
it can become English if you
so when people mean that, when John Cleese mean that, I think implicit in that was a racial element, not exclusively, but in addition to the ethnic, which is a cultural, which is a historical, which is a shared values thing. So it's a package thing. But I think English identity is, as a Raj, I think you say, partly racial. So you couldn't just be an Eskimo that came here and said, I'm an Englishman, put on a top hat and smoked a pipe or whatever, and I'm an Englishman. That wouldn't quite work. Although it might do now, but it wouldn't in the way I'm talking about it. There has to be some indigenous relationship with the country.
Does it come down to religion?
No, because I'm an Englishman and I'm a Muslim, so does that make me a foreigner? No.
But I think...
Sorry, dude, I've got another white person here that you want.
A white person? Oh my God! Congratulations! Wow! Do come in.
Come on.
You've got to face. What's your name? Will. Oh, nice English name. And
one brown person in it.
did you come here by accident or you? Shh! Don't ruin it! Don't ruin it!
Anglo-Saxons come from...
I mentioned the war.
And of course, my name is Paul. It's actually a Greek word, Paulus, which unfortunately means small in Greek. But I don't tend to tell people. Are you aware what we're discussing at all?
A bit. I was just caught on to John Cleese.
So basically, John Cleese said
We're not talking about comedy. We're talking about.
He thought that London is not English.
Exactly. That's what we're talking about.
The demographic kind of change of London. He doesn't feel like it's what he grew up with. So
It's not English, he said.
Yeah, he doesn't feel like it's somewhere that he.
Are you aware of that? Have you heard the news about that at all?
I didn't see it.
No.
But I asked you, what does he mean by English?
Well, that's the question. That's what we're discussing. What is it to be English? What is our identity? And is it what challenges face us as English people in London? And so he just asked, is religion part of it? I say, well, I'm a Muslim and I'm English, but I'm just as English as I was before. I mean, if I'm a Christian and I follow Jesus as my Lord, that's okay. But hang on, Jesus was a Middle East, a brown-skinned Middle Eastern Aramaic-speaking Jew from 2,000 years ago, and somehow that's less foreign than me following also another Middle Eastern guy from a bit more recent times from the same part of the world. I mean, somehow one is alien and foreign, another one isn't. Yet they both come from the same.
One's established for 1,000 years.
It should, but in terms of the DNA of the religion, they both come from the Middle East, from non-white people, and so that's kind of all I'm saying. So, jumping in the deep end here, but do you have any thoughts about what English identity is, if it exists at all?
Well, I believe it's kind of a social construct. It's
Right.
constantly changing as our history changes.
Yes.
So we're actually recreating it right now.
But do you find it
this
controversial?
idea that we need to conserve the past is really just illusory. I think.
But do you think I could ever become
Raj,
Hang
hang on a second.
You're limiting.
It's an English person, here.
all right, get the brown man out.
Get the brown out. Now, my question is, I'm going to challenge that now on the basis that part of our English identity is that we have a shared history, so we can look back and we look at the English Civil War, we can talk about the way that the settlement with Parliament, the English settlement with Parliament and the monarch and the relationship between how laws are made and so on. And this isn't just something that's changing every 5 minutes. I know some things are, but in terms of the constitutional settlement, what we have today is pretty much the same as we had under Victorian era, as we had under the 100 years before that. That hasn't changed. Now, particularly with the EU, there may have been some change with that EU law. But if we're coming out of the EU, we're back to where we were for many, many, many generations.
Are you saying that history is kind of objective, like we all have the same idea as history? Because even our own idea about history in the present is changing as we go through time. So
I'm saying that there are some constants in our identity which just seem to continue inexorably throughout our generations. And I mentioned the political and the governance aspect as being one. And I find it it's much more anecdotal and subjective, but when I go abroad, even to my beloved France, I'm aware that I'm an Englishman. How can I, here I'm like a fish in water. I swim around, I'm not aware of the water. If I go to that pond over there, the water tastes different, although it's still water, and I'm still swimming around in it. But hey, I've got to be slightly more careful with the menu that I don't order, horse or oysters or whatever, not, snails or something. But pretty much the same. But it is different. It's a different flavour to it. even though we're mostly the same actually. The French and the English are the same, pretty much, I think.
But do you feel it's racist that somebody like John Cleese would say that he feels that Englishness has gone and that he feels like it's something that's a bad thing? You said it's racist. Some people are calling him a racist. I don't think it is.
It's difficult. I don't know what he meant by that statement. It's difficult to say. Choose how many words was it? 10 or something?
It was
on Twitter. Volumes and volumes of commentary from 10 words.
I'd
like to add something. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
My name is Maria Elena Fernandez. I'm
Where are you from?
Mexican American. I was born and raised in Los Angeles. My parents are.
So you're not a fan of Trump then? Okay.
He's the worst thing that has happened.
Funny, I could go.
Break down that wall.
Yeah, exactly. So, from my perspective, just to get a perspective from across the pond and very different, historical context. But I'll one of our struggles that we have in the U.S. We have a very different history, but I think really the answer is to cultivate a pluralistic identity as a nation. I think I agree with what you're saying. It's a social construct, and the history you're talking about, or the
continuity
that you're talking about, that's also based on hegemony. That's based on a dominant culture and a dominant history, and those who won all the wars, etc. And those who lost or those who were marginalized in any way, our stories are not included. So if we can, I would like to see that in my country, and not that it's easy, not that there aren't growing pains. I think profound and difficult growing pains. But many cultures and many societies have gone through them at different times, and I think that's what we're up against. Are we capable of broadening our vision of what a country and a nation is? That it can still be the same political entity and even the same dominant culture in terms of the let's say the language and how the institutions and political institutions operate. But can we have a inclusive vision where there is room for a variety of cultures, and we all abide by those,
I think that's a good point. I think as a nation, as the United Kingdom, we've always been like that, because the Scots and the Welsh and the English and the Northern Irish or the Irish or whatever, it's always been pluralist in that sense. It's never been homogenous culturally, because we've always had the Scottish people who eat their food and do their thing, had a separate legal system to some extent. But I think what we've done in Britain, which is perhaps a really good thing, historically England, is we've institutionalized opposition. So we have the leader, Her Majesty's opposition, the leader of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, is an official title. The opposition is part of the system. And even down here at Speaker's Corner, we've had, you talk about the minority voices that have been silenced, but they haven't really been silenced, because Speaker's Corner was set aside by Parliament itself in the 19th century to allow trade unionists and others to demonstrate without being arrested for preaching the peace. And people like Karl Marx came down here, Lenin came down here, George Orwell came down here, and these were hardly part of the establishment. And they were allowed by law to speak without being molested, and they were never arrested. That's how Karl Marx ended up in London in the first place, was because he couldn't find an unmolested safe haven in France and Germany and Belgium, where he was kicked out. So he found refuge in London and was allowed to exist for all his life in London without ever being arrested for anything. So we have a tradition of tolerance in England, surprisingly perhaps, and institutionalized opposition. The opposition is respected and accepted and allowed to have its voice. Are there limits to this? Yes, of course there have to be limits to this, and that's the question we're here today. I think there is an English identity, not just continuity of history. I think there's an ethnic element to it as well. We shouldn't be shy of saying that. Just as the Japanese have an ethnic identity, the Nigerians do, the Saudi Arabians do, whatever. Why shouldn't we recognise the English have identity as well? And I think I think that is a valid point. Should we recognise it and treasure it and promote it? Why not? Because we as a country, and the Scots as well and so on, have given the world so much. Everything from the Industrial Revolution itself, the invention of the steam engine, even the World Wide Web. Even the World Wide Web was actually invented by Sir Tim, what's his name, who's an Englishman, who's alive today. So Tim Berners-Lee, he's actually Berners-Lee. He actually invented the World Wide Web, which all the world now uses.
But it doesn't,
so
I'm not implying or suggesting to erase that. In fact, I'm completely against erasing anybody, and I acknowledge, of course, that history and, even as I said, the history of the winners. However, I do think that there's a way to there must be a way where we can have,
No, I've got
you
very
know,
bad
that whole
sense of
concept of both and, you know.
But we do already.
Can I say something?
We already
Can I
do.
say,
We do in
I've been
England.
to
We
LA
do already.
twice. I don't like the place. I'm being honest with you.
It's difficult. It's a difficult
it's
place.
nice
It's so
to look
spread out,
at.
isn't it? How
It's
do you-
nice to look
yeah,
at, but
yeah.
I wouldn't live there.
No, I wouldn't
And the
either.
thing is, no offense, and I was
San Francisco is much nicer.
But what I did realise, which is a positive about America, is that I was quite shocked when I went to LA airport that there were so many Chinese and Mexican people there. In fact, I very rarely saw an African American or even a white person once in a while in that particular area. And it's only
In
when you
the
went,
airport
it's only when you
area?
went to Orange County and places like that, then I started seeing more white people. But the one thing I did find is that whether someone was Mexican, Chinese, whatever,